Hello and welcome to the first official installment of this channel. This is the beginning of a series of 6 videos covering one of my favorite franchises of all time, Star Wars. Over the years, the Star Wars phenomenon has attracted a larger audience than practically any other franchise, leaving the filmmakers with a lot of pressure to deliver on the next installment. And while The Force Awakens and Rogue One have been criticized, the overall response was fairly positive. There is, however, a substantially disproportionate amount of fan backlash directed towards Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi, and that is what this is all about. I'll be breaking this series into 6 separate parts, each revolving around a certain aspect of understanding the film in order to effectively rewrite it. Part 1, what you're watching now, will contain the first half of an analysis of The Last Jedi, noting the issues small and large that led to the surprising disparity in opinion over the quality of the film. Part 2 will follow with the second half of the analysis since there is a lot of material to cover. Part 3 will revolve around a complete ground-up rewrite of The Force Awakens. In my sequel trilogy rewrites, I'll be creating 2 separate stories for each film. The first will only be outlined, but in it I will attempt to keep the foundations of the film intact in order to explain what could have been created under the same circumstances as the filmmakers. The second version of the rewrites will be fully written drafts of the film and will deviate rather drastically from the current ones to make what I believe to be a much better story. Part 4 of this series will be a discussion about the franchise as a whole, the prequels, and other areas of Star Wars lore, particularly their influence on Disney's Star Wars. Part 5 will be my actual rewrite of The Last Jedi, given everything we've gone over up until that point. Lastly, Part 6 will be the conclusion, including a discussion on Episode 9, the standalone films, and the future of Star Wars. In that segment, we will also be going over everything we've discussed and potentially bringing in some additional insights from comments on the first 5 parts. And for those who haven't seen Star Wars or The Last Jedi, why are you here? Stop it. So, hindsight is 20/20. Analyzing content retrospectively is much easier than starting from scratch with a blank sheet of paper. I'd just like to make sure I'm not ignoring or sidestepping the difficulty and stress of creating a multi-million-dollar feature film. I don't anticipate everyone will be 100% on board with my rewrites, and that's a good thing. Discussion is what helps to give some form to the craft of filmmaking. Point being, it is incredibly hard to make everyone happy, especially when it comes to Star Wars, and I give both J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson massive kudos for taking on such a vilified position and wading through the hate. That being said, The Last Jedi was terrible. It's pretty bad. I know, shocker, but had I liked it, I wouldn't be trying to do better. So anyone looking for an overall positive review of the film probably won't like most of what I have to say. So to clarify, the main point I'll be making throughout this review is that The Last Jedi is a train wreck of a screenplay and has far too many flaws to deserve the critical acclaim it currently possesses. Throughout this video, I'll be covering themes, character development, story structure, world building, and a plethora of other topics. With that, let's dive into the first piece of this series, my analysis of Star Wars The Last Jedi. Part 1. So I want to start where the film does, the opening crawl. This is normally where we'll get caught up on what's going on in the galaxy, where the heroes and villains are, and the conflict brewing between them. This is the start of our world building. Now, Star Wars has been known since the very beginning to have quality world building, exhibited in A New Hope through the Empire's sovereign control of systems, Tatooine administration and culture, smuggling trade routes, and a history of galactic war and ancient religions, effectively allowing for a larger universe and more interesting character development to occur. Personally, the world building was one of the main things that kept me invested in Star Wars for so long. And of course, I love the characters, but something I really lived for was that horizon Luke Skywalker looked out past. It was everything beyond the audience's field of view that really grasped my interest. The mention of past conflicts, otherworldly adventures, and hijinks with dangerous creatures really captivated my investment in not just the characters we grew to love in the films, but the characters outside of the motion picture canon. And we'll touch on this later, but comparatively, the sequel trilogy appears to be essentially devoid of any expansive universe whatsoever. So, all in all, the world building is the foundation of what the franchise was and is today, and it's really unfortunate that the new films seem to miss one of the biggest elements of constructing a Star Wars film. But beginning with the opening crawl, the first sentence reads, "The First Order reigns." Now, I'm not going to make a full critique of The Force Awakens, but I will briefly mention that the universe of The Last Jedi is heavily reliant on that of its predecessors, since these are all sequels. Neither Episode 7 or 8 really give us much information on the current events of the galaxy outside of the situation at hand, how the Republic is attempting to recover from their massive loss, how the galaxy is reacting to this act of terror, how the First Order is taking over so many systems, how extensive their forces are, how much the destruction of Starkiller Base impacted them, etc. That sense of an expansive universe that we got in the originals and the prequels isn't a part of the sequel trilogy. We have no perspective and hardly even mention of perspective outside of the current situation. We get no fallout from the destruction of the Republic, no rebellion other than 4 cruisers that are only able to survive because the system-crippling warmongering First Order can't blow them up. This is a flaw shared by both films, but we'll get into that eventually. The crawl continues to explain that the Resistance is the only thing standing against the First Order, so they have become a primary target. And I'm left to wonder why they're the only ones fighting against this inexplicably massive superpower. It's mentioned so offhand as if the Republic's destruction meant absolutely nothing to the rest of the galaxy. One would think that even those opposed to the Republic would take issue with the mass genocide of so many during peacetime. Let's do a bit of quick math. Assuming that, on average, an individual on Hosnian Prime has 3 family members and 2 friends off-planet, let's say. That's lowballing 5 people that are friendly to them. Now, if these planets all have a population similar to Coruscant, because it's basically Coruscant, there are 2 trillion inhabitants of each planet. So at minimum, 50 trillion creatures spread out across the galaxy lost a close friend or family member in a single destructive attack. At minimum. Because the First Order killed indiscriminately. This wasn't a racial or cultural genocide. This wasn't even a governmental or ideological genocide. They wiped out an entire system of planets, full of an infinite set of beliefs and backgrounds. We can also safely assume that a collection of high-level government officials from across the galaxy gathered on this planet. Beings that had joined forces for the past 30 years to create the peace that they finally achieved after decades of the Empire's tyrannical rule. Hundreds of planets would lose valued cultural, political, and ideological leaders to a faction of faceless authoritarian nobodies that suddenly pop up and decide to take over the galaxy. All of this, and we are supposed to accept that no one joined forces in any of these systems to avenge the deaths of anybody. So I apologize for seeming left out of the loop if the films aren't going to explore the fallout of this obviously severely impactful event in galactic history. It's super jarring to jump from the First Order beating the Republic, to the Resistance beating the First Order, to the First Order beating the Resistance. There is a lot missing here, and it doesn't do these films any favors to pretend otherwise. The crawl also reads that the Resistance is certain that Luke Skywalker will return and spark hope within the ranks. So they're essentially hanging on to the gamble that Rey has found Luke, convinced him to come back, and is currently on her way to the base, where Luke will then lead the charge against the First Order. This is a tactically flawed plan. General Leia Organa is a general, and it discredits her character to write the Resistance as an idle herd of sheep waiting for the shepherd to come guide them. And it comes off as lazy to disregard the rest of the universe. Why haven't they contacted members of the Republic for aid? Why haven't they been in contact with any smaller rebellions in the galaxy? What have they been doing with their time on this base for the past 2 films? What is all of this? What are they doing here? What could all of these people possibly be working on? But at this point, the crawl transitions into the preamble of the story. The Resistance has been found out. How did the Resistance find out that they found them out? I don't know. In any case, they're evacuating, and the First Order arrives on the scene. And it blows my mind that this level of military ineptitude is even possible. Why aren't they firing on the base? Fire on the base! Why aren't they sending out any fighters? This kind of thing really bugged me throughout the film because it shows up constantly. There are 3 Star Destroyers just lounging around while this legendary fleet killer is doing just about everything except killing fleets. The First Order has got to be the worst military force in the galaxy. It's a miracle that they've functioned for this long. As the scene progressed, this just annoyed me more and more. Now, already we have the first big problem in the movie. The film does not address gaps in logic, particularly military logic, that plague the film. Hardly any of the strategies by either the First Order or the Resistance make any sense, leading many viewers to find both parties to be completely incompetent. This pattern of flawed military strategy appears all over the place in the film. As well, we as an audience have to fill in a considerable amount of gaps to make sense of the rules and logic of the story, and that makes the writing look sloppy. When you write a script for a sequel, you have to take into consideration the information passed down from previous films in order to make your plot feel at least semi-coherent. Let's talk about General Armitage Hux real quick. In The Force Awakens, he was portrayed as the formidable general of the First Order's military, and a rival of Kylo Ren. Right from the opening of the first scene, we can see a complete 180-degree shift in his character's portrayal, turning him into a foolish, incompetent blowhard, and all for the sake of comedy. Now, this introduces several additional problems with the film. You'll find that The Last Jedi has a lot of comedy. I have no objections to levity in an action blockbuster. I do, however, take issue with the frequency and tone of it throughout the film. It's difficult to establish the darker tone the film seems to be going for when so many jokes are strewn about. If it were reduced to a few funnies thrown into some lighter character-building scenes, it would probably make more sense. The other thing about comedy is that it can be very tricky to execute due to the fact that humor comes in all different colors, and filmmakers have to figure out which brand works best for the tone of their film. The kind used in The Last Jedi is reminiscent of buddy cop films or sitcoms, and is riddled with slapstick, one-liners, anticlimaxes, double takes, sexual innuendos, parody, anything and everything under the sun. This problem lies not in the jokes themselves, but the context in which they're provided. The original trilogy's particular brand of humor, for example, was almost always based in character or plot, keeping it light, but also sometimes driving conflict or character growth in a natural way. It kept integrated in the scene and avoided detracting from the moment by trying to wink at the audience. The big issue really comes in when the filmmakers decide to ignore continuity and change a pre-existing character's personality to fit the overall tone of the film or in order to push a plot point. But aside from the treatment of characters, which I will go in depth on, The Last Jedi seems to not have a solid grasp on how tone should be used. And tone here refers to the overall mood of the scene, combining the dialogue, the pace, the score, the lighting, pretty much anything that sets the emotion of the scene. In many scenes, the tone is previously set quite dramatically to push the story in a specific direction, but in the middle of the serious drama, a joke will completely switch the tone of the scene for a few seconds, often taking the audience out of the movie. This kind of comedy is echoed throughout the film, and it also happens to bring me to my next criticism. Comedy is tricky to write, and there obviously isn't a formula to make the perfect jokes. Humor is quite subjective like that. But the thing about the humor in The Last Jedi is that it all feels so hollow because none of the comedy has any effect on the film. They're just jokes for the sake of jokes, and they seem to go out of their way to do this in a very forced, on-cue manner. Character development and plot advancement are two of the most important elements in film, and they are completely disregarded for story beats that don't make any sense because Rian thought it was necessary to make this a funny movie. So in a nutshell, character continuity is ignored to fit Rian's wishes, the comedy creates tone-deaf scenes, and is overall used without purpose or respect for the characters or audience. But these criticisms aren't necessarily always separate problems. Quite often they piggyback on each other because of a single writing decision. In Poe and Hux's first confrontation, the audience may find themselves confused as to why Hux isn't immediately ordering Poe's death. We soon find out that Poe is stalling for time with a crank call, making Hux out to be a foolish court jester, and Hux orders the fleet to open fire only after Poe lands the "your mama" joke. Another problem with this is that his mustache-twirling soliloquies cliché directly contradicts his actions. He's making a grandiose speech about how he's going to destroy the Resistance, rather than actually destroying them. Jeopardizing characters and the rules of your story to make a joke is objectively bad writing, and it just shows his incompetence on the part of the villains in order to keep the plot rolling. And all of this piggybacks onto my next criticism. Character development is being introduced without being explained. Characters develop and change over time, and that's fine, but the audience needs to see it in order to emotionally invest themselves. If a character like Hux seems to be a different person in the sequel to the previous film, normal development dictates that something must have happened to him in between that we didn't see. Films do this constantly, but if a sequel is well made, the character's progress will appear seamless between the two. At least it won't change drastically without being established. Anyway, this problem comes up with several characters in the film, and it just goes to show that Rian ignored basic components of The Force Awakens to push the story forward, essentially retconning everything before to give us this fresh new Star Wars. Along a similar vein, the same criticism for the character development could be said about the plot of the film. It appears to drop or drastically alter the trajectory of plot threads from The Force Awakens, leaving the audience wondering why any of it was set up in the first place. This, of course, isn't the fault of The Force Awakens. J.J. Abrams had a plan for his characters throughout the trilogy, and Rian was given the power to take whatever route he wanted. If you're going to change the direction of a character or a plot thread, at least have the courtesy to help us understand why and establish it in the film. Okay, so I think I've made my point fairly adequately on Hux. He's been turned into a strategically deaf goofball. Fine. So running through this first scene, Poe begins taking out the cannons with ease, and Hux angrily asks why this is happening. As one does. Kennedy then exclaims that they need to scramble their fighters. This again adds to Hux's bafflingly poor military judgment. The first tie that comes out hits Poe immediately, but only manages to knock out his weapons system. How convenient. BB-8 then messes with the X-Wing circuits to make it work again. And this would be a good example when I point to unnecessary comedy. The plot elements appear to be created around the jokes, and not the other way around. Hardly any of the gags in this film are servicing the plot. Rather, they're one of the symptoms of many of its poorly paced, emotionally tone-deaf scenes. Why did Hux wait to shoot Poe? So he could engage in a prank call. Why did Poe get shot so easily by a TIE fighter? So BB-8 could make a funny, and so on. Or they're just stupid, which, doesn't create endearing protagonists or intimidating villains. Sacrificing plot and character for jokes is bad. Please stop doing it. While BB-8 is doing his thing, Kennedy orders the now charged autocannons to destroy the empty base, while all of the evacuation cruisers are making their way safely to the Raddus. I actually liked Captain Kennedy despite his small part in this movie. He was actually intelligent most of the time, kept his cool in the face of Hux's stupidity, and even acted somewhat honorably in the face of death. But unfortunately, even he was ruined, and was made to aim for the wrong target. Even if there were still ships on the planet, it makes infinitely more sense to knock out their main cruiser, a ship with hyperspace capabilities that happens to contain all of the Resistance's leadership. This whole scenario doesn't make the Resistance look smart or clever, it just makes the First Order look ridiculous. I'd like to talk about the ensuing space battle between the Resistance and the First Order. And there's a lot I could go over. The foolish military tactics on both sides of the conflict, the inefficient bomber design, the strangely vital God remote, the bomb drop mechanics, the lack of gravity in space. What I'm really curious about, however, is Rian Johnson's insertion of a new hero character. Ladies and gents, let me introduce you to Tweedledee, Paige Tico. So catching up, once Poe and his squadron charge into battle with the First Order's TIE fighters, they are all immediately blown to hell, because scissors beats paper, I suppose. All of the bomber-class cruisers are downed, save for one. Enter Paige. A seemingly inauspicious protagonist, Paige is shown to be the only hope for the Resistance. She makes haste to the remote that is required to drop the bombs, and is able to push the magic button in time to save the day. Now, I'm going to explain why this is all a massive waste in screen time. The scene is played incredibly emotionally, with Paige heroically dropping the bombs, clutching her Haitian smelt medallion, and perishing in a blaze of fiery glory. And the film expects people to find any of this interesting. First off, we won't understand who this character is or why what she's doing matters until later. We're being given the payoff before the setup, and it doesn't give us much of anything to think about. In A New Hope, we are invested in the trench run at the climax of the film because we spent a whole hour and a half getting to know Luke Skywalker and growing to care about what happens to him. Nothing in this moment has that level of emotional investment or setup associated with it. That's why normally films leave the first act as development for characters. Secondly, Paige's struggle lacks emotional investment because her struggle isn't expressed. What does she fight for? Is it the Resistance? That would be the safe bet, but she could be fighting for a multitude of reasons. Maybe religious or familial causes, as the necklace could imply. Maybe revenge for her fallen comrades, or even selfish reasons like fame or status. The point is, we aren't given enough time to understand her motivation, and by the time we see her acting heroic in the scene, we don't have the information needed to empathize with this character's plight. She's laying down her life, and I really wish I cared. Thirdly, Paige's role is dual-purposed, but neither is necessary. Her role as Rose's sister is inconsequential to the plot, and the bombing run could have been done by anybody. If it was Rian's intention to make us care more about Rose because of Paige's death, it would have been much more effective to play the scene much quicker, flash the medallion, and move on. Instead, the scene tells us that this character is very important, and we should pay attention to her. Less is sometimes more, and had the film downplayed her role and paced the scene better, the audience might empathize more with Rose upon the medallion reveal later. Or just remove the character altogether. That'd work too. Anyway, all the bombs fly down towards the Dreadnought, and the Resistance wins. Hooray. We now enter into a new conflict of the story. How many lives can be lost before a victory becomes futile? An interesting concept, I'll admit. You see movies all the time where some victories are celebrated over tremendous success, and others are more melancholic as the losses have crossed over the threshold of revelry. As the Resistance is cheering for their victory, Leia stares at a screen showing the heavy casualties they've suffered. She doesn't believe the campaign was worth the losses. And this is where the nuance of combat decisions comes in. Poe made a judgment call from his gut. He believed that if the Resistance didn't attempt to take out the Dreadnought while they had the upper hand, it would come back to bite them later. And that's just it. At this point in the film, nobody knows what could happen. Poe's instinct in this case was in fact correct. Had they not taken the Dreadnought down, the First Order would have simply followed them through hyperspace after they escaped, and taken them down immediately. The argument would then be that had Poe's plan backfired and gotten everyone killed, the blood would be on his hands. The film could have argued that it was a rash decision, possibly even made because of Poe's combative personality. Leia could even have argued that Poe's desire to finish the assault on the ship blinded him to the greater scheme of the war, and that would have been a great conflict to explore with Poe and Leia. But instead, the film bastardizes his actions and treats the incident as if he were an idiot douchebag pilot with no regard for the safety of his fellow Resistance members. Hey! And here's the difference. Poe isn't stupid. He may be confident, brash, and even risky, but it all lends to his claim as the best pilot in the Resistance. He understands risk, and unlike everyone else in the film, he understands strategy. He accounted for the fact that the cannons had already been taken out, and it made sense to finish the job while they had a tactical advantage, and while the First Order was caught off guard. The filmmakers are painting a picture of a reckless hotshot pilot that just doesn't exist. And the craziest thing is that the Resistance pilots are all on board with him. They all follow Poe into battle, acknowledging the risks in order to take out what he refers to as a fleet killer. They are all making the selfless decision to lay their lives on the line for the survival of the cause, and Poe is subsequently demoted, emasculated, and reconditioned because of it. We'll revisit this in the next few scenes, but moving on, Hux is slammed onto the ground with the Force and comically dragged around the floor when Snoke finds out that they've lost the Resistance. Hux tells Snoke that they can track ships through hyperspace without the use of a physical tracker, a technical achievement that has supposedly been in the works for many years, yet Snoke knows nothing about its existence. Alrighty, next scene. Finn wakes up and falls over in a way that I can only assume was meant to be a joke. A pattern that emerges here is that Finn is another slave to the film's comedy, although instead of being a goofy slapstick character, he is the quippy one-liner character. Not to say his comedy was always bad, but it often missed the mark for me. Poe sees him wandering, runs up to greet him, and says, "You must have 1,000 questions." And without missing a beat, Finn replies, "Where's Rey?" And I really enjoyed this small moment between them. It re-established the connection that the two had, and it follows the character of Finn to a T. The last thing he did before he was knocked into a coma was protect Rey from Kylo Ren. It makes perfect sense that he cares about her more than anything else, including the Resistance. Overall, I found the scene enjoyable, but it was quickly overshadowed by what was to follow. This next scene is one of great controversy, echoing the message of the rest of the film. We pick up where The Force Awakens left off. Rey, with her arm outstretched, offers Anakin's lightsaber to the missing legend himself, Jedi Master Luke Skywalker. Standing at the edge of the cliff, Luke takes the hilt and stares down at it, possibly reflecting on the past, all the history the saber held. This was his first Jedi weapon, originally the weapon of his father, a man Luke admired as a boy, handed down to him from his teacher, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the weapon he lost when his father cut off his hand in battle, disappearing through the clouds of Bespin not to be recovered for over 30 years. This is possibly the first time he's looked back at his life like this, all the choices he's made, good and bad. He looks up at Rey, and chucks it over his shoulder like a piece of trash. Dare I explain why this is a poor decision? Tone, anticlimax, character. Luke storms past Rey and she becomes confused, as one does. Chewie breaks down Luke's door so Rey can try to convince him to come back. Chewie then growls at Luke in his native Wookiee tongue, and Rey, the scavenger from Jakku, the desert planet, interprets for him. Ryan is trolling us. In this film and The Force Awakens, Rey's mysterious connection to all these things, be it Leia walking to her instead of Chewie after the death of Han, her crazy abilities as a pilot, a sharpshooter, a multilingual interpreter, these all appear to be intentional but have no direction associated with it. We have all this setup revolving around the coincidences of this strangely perfect girl, and it leads us to assume that there's something behind it all. That's mainly why fans got so invested in theories about her parents in the first place. We are given this insane amount of setup that appears to be intentional, and are never given any payoff for it. How does Rey understand Wookiee? And why does she just assume Luke doesn't? It's insulting to write Rey in as the bridge for this dialogue between two characters that have known each other since Luke was a teenager. This is largely the fault of The Force Awakens, as it was Abrams' responsibility to create these characters, but Ryan sure isn't helping with the addition of more confusing abilities. But of course, the insults don't stop there. Once Luke realizes they came on the Falcon, he wonders why Han didn't come along. Once he understands the truth, we cut away. I know this has been criticized into the grave, it's just sad that we get nothing more than a quick deleted scene. But let's continue. My God, we're not even 20 minutes in. So we finally get to see the all-powerful Supreme Leader Snoke in all his golden glory. Well, I can say that Andy Serkis's portrayal is certainly not lost in the full CGI character, as he is emoted very well. And I guess I'll just make a note of the visuals in general here. Some of them are incredibly well done. I loved pretty much every shot of Snoke purely due to the impressive amount of detail put into the design, right down to the chin hairs. The lightsaber effects also put a smile on my face every time they were used. But a lot of the effects I honestly found to be subpar. And I don't mean that they're bad, I just think that compared to the effects of Rogue One and The Force Awakens, they were a bit lackluster. Like, look at it side by side and you'll see what I mean. And that all has to do with the way the film was shot as well. And I can go into more detail eventually on that, but just to give a few examples, the porgs occasionally seemed very cartoonish, the physics of the explosions, blasts, and debris were wildly inaccurate, and the characters often looked green-screened onto their background, like Tally in the first scene, Luke and Rey on the mountain, and some of the pilots on the crate speeder chase. And in nearly every space scene, I felt like most everything had a heavy video game vibe. Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful film. I don't hate the way the film was shot, and the VFX only took me out of the experience a few times, but overall I would say I prefer the look and effects of Episode 7 and Rogue One. I don't expect everyone will agree with me on the visuals, but there you are. In the throne room, Snoke begins preaching on why he keeps Hux around, then begins to roast Kylo Ren for not being everything he had hoped. Ren begins to speak, but Snoke cuts him short, ordering him to take off his ridiculous mask. And I want to address the controversy of this element. As it stands, it makes no sense for Kylo to flip so quickly and become a confident villain. It negates his character from The Force Awakens, how uncomfortable he was with being seen, and the imposing image he desired. This could have been formed into an interesting conversation piece throughout the film, though. With a slightly better understanding of the characters, the filmmakers could have inserted a talking point about Kylo's obvious adulation of his grandfather, turning him weak and dependent. His desire to be respected by his teacher could have been explored through his subservience in taking the mask off, but later returning to it as a rejection of Snoke's authority. But instead, we'll just have him take it off so he can make kissy faces at Rey. Back on Octo once again, Rey tries to convince Luke to come back. She explains that the First Order is beginning to control major systems and will have taken over most of them in mere weeks. Again, would have been great to see some of this. Are there any small, system-wide rebellions taking place? Has the Republic gone underground for fear of extinction? Some world building would really set the stakes, but all we know is that the galaxy is in peril. So now the audience gets an exclusive MTV Cribs look at the daily life of Luke Skywalker. He goes down to the beach and engages in the most pointless scene in the film. And there were a lot of pointless scenes in the film. In Rian Johnson's director's commentary, all that he would mention during the scene, and a lot of other scenes for that matter, was how they used practical effects to create these creatures. Oh man, practical effects. Automatic 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. Apparently, Lucasfilm flew in these massive creatures on helicopters and had to build a special path for the crew to get down to the beach, because it was a very hard place to get to. They went to a lot of effort to get this scene, put a lot of money and time into the planning and execution, and it adds absolutely nothing to the characters or the story. Anyway, the scene is basically Luke milking this quadruple-breasted Goose-Seal. You've all seen it. He also goes and catches a fish, which I thought was actually pretty cool. It's honestly just nice to see him actively doing something and not just sitting around complaining about stuff. Moving on from that, we have our first Jedi Tree scene, affirming Luke's separation from the Jedi Order, then transition to the Resistance's now minuscule fleet dropping out of hyperspace into the middle of nowhere. This next few scenes is tough to explain in chronological order because it relies on different information throughout the story. So I'll start with Poe and Leia. Poe is demoted, and he and Leia have a back and forth about the trade of lives in pursuit of victory. Poe exclaims that they succeeded in their mission to destroy the Dreadnought, and Leia inquires as to the cost of doing so. Poe makes the argument that when you start an attack, you follow it through, which is a very generalized statement, and that approach doesn't articulate Poe's point very well. This is obviously no mistake on the part of the writer, as Poe is being made out to be an impulsive attention whore seeking validation as a heroic figure. But it really feels forced because it's a massive disconnect from the Poe that we saw only one film ago, and even still from the previous scene. I never got an overwhelming sense that Poe's desire was to receive glory and praise for his exploits. He cares about BB-8, he cares about the Resistance, he cares about Leia, and he cares about the Finn.
The Finn?
He's incredibly loyal to the cause in every scene we've seen him in, frequently going above and beyond the call of duty to the point of deserving every bit of acclaim he receives, yet this one conversation is supposed to turn the audience against him. Leia tells Poe to get his head out of his cockpit, which I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. Most likely, she thinks he enjoys being the hero, with no regard for the trail of lives he leaves behind, which is again a massive mischaracterization from what we've seen so far. Leia says there are some things Poe can't solve by jumping in an X-Wing and blowing something up, which, okay, now I'm unsure again of what her point is. I have to assume that what she's inferring here is that Poe enjoys using brute force too much, preventing him from using strategy, which is not really a mischaracterization. Every problem we've seen Poe facing is dealt with by means of a weapon or a ship. In fact, that explains Poe's inability to flee Jakku in The Force Awakens. His desire to solve the problem with a weapon caused him to get captured and tortured, even though he had a perfect opportunity to escape. This is also portrayed in The Last Jedi when Poe is unable to flee from battle when the Resistance has fully evacuated. The obvious difference, of course, is the opportunity. Poe had nothing to gain by shooting a few stormtroopers, but had everything to lose that they didn't take out the dreadnought. Had they gone with this element full force, I would be 100% on board. As a matter of fact, that would be a great character flaw for him. Being unable to resist the temptation of battle, even if it means abandoning a more intelligent strategy. I imagine that's what they attempted in this film, but there was an obvious disconnect between the message and the delivery, leaving his motivation confused. And that's aside from the secondary element they tried to push of Poe wanting to seem like a hero. Were his motivation done properly, they could have even fixed a hole in the previous film, which would be impressive. But that's only the surface. His character is tampered with in more ways than one, and we'll explore at length when we get there. But for now, the Resistance is alerted to the presence of the encroaching First Order fleet, and it is revealed that they've been tracked through hyperspace, something that has not been known to be possible before, preventing the Resistance from escaping. The fighters make their way towards their stations and prepare to get airborne, but while assembling, Kylo Ren approaches the hangar and destroys it in its entirety. All of the pilots and the engineers in the hangar, except for Poe, are killed. Kylo Ren has dealt severe damage to the exterior of the ship and completely annihilated what was left of their fleet, and it's confusing that this was so easy. Before the attack began, Admiral Akbar could be heard in the background announcing that the shields were being rotated to the rear as their ship was turning away from the First Order Star Destroyers. However, Kylo Ren was seen flying right through the shields and blasting the ship's hull to pieces. This is a prime example of a retcon. When you change the shields from something the audience is familiar with, it should be supported by a plot point or a line describing why things are happening differently than before. You don't need to spell it out for us, just give us an idea of how what you're doing makes sense. We can see the shields are separated from the ship by a great distance when the First Order blasts hit the rear of the ship, which arc in space, by the way, and Kylo is able to move past them and blast through the ship with ease. Not only is this poor ship design, again, but it doesn't match up with the rest of Star Wars canon. Ships have always been known to have shields close to the hull, and they have never been able to pass through them like this. This is Chekhov's gun Deus Ex Machina level filmmaking 101. Please stop changing the rules for no reason. It's great if you want to introduce something new, but if the rules are different, you have to give the audience something to grab a hold of. The same thing applies to Kylo's hangar bombing. As he makes his approach, he enters a small tunnel that leads to the hangar, but we don't see any shields preventing the fleet from being sucked out into space, and Kylo's missiles don't appear to interact with any kind of shields. So it's strange that no one is being sucked out into space, especially if the hangar is blown up. Nothing appears to be affected in terms of artificial gravity or air pressure. The hangar door is closed, but there's no point if the rules of space don't apply. And I'm curious just how Kylo managed to get out of the tunnel, since it only seems to go in a single direction. So Poe is left without an X-Wing, and the leaders attempt to force the enemy fighters back by moving out of range of the mother ships. And surprisingly, this works, despite the First Order having a massive advantage. Kylo now flies near the bridge of the Raddus and has a character moment when he struggles when presented the opportunity to kill his mother. He hesitates and his wingmen take out the ship's bridge, blowing the leadership into space. Hux contacts Kylo and tells him to return to the fleet because they can't cover him. And unfortunately, this plot point is the crux of the entire storyline. This is the decision that sparks the entire rest of the film, and it is terribly dull. The First Order can't destroy the Resistance cruisers because they are A, unwilling to send fighters to destroy them, and B, too far away for their main cannons to harm them. There are so many ways that the First Order could take care of the last few cruisers with ease, possibly even without casualties. Because may I remind you, Kylo Ren blew up all of their fighters. They literally cannot fight back aside from their ship's cannons, assuming their ship has cannons. So basically, the entire premise of this story is set on the idea that the First Order is going to wait for the Resistance to burn fuel so that they can destroy them. If the Resistance is faster and lighter, they should be able to lose you. Yet you're able to keep pace with them just fine. So now the scene shifts to Leia floating in space, seemingly dead, and it's then revealed that she's in fact alive and has force abilities that can pull her back to the ship and save her life. First off, she didn't die instantly from the explosion, debris, or just the massive change in pressure and temperature. How convenient. Also, she was in space for several minutes, and both ships were moving forward at a steady pace. So, if anything, the blast of the ship would have blown her further away since there is no resistance in space. When it comes to Leia's use of force powers, that's a tougher one to quantify. It's been established in the past that Leia has the potential to use the Force, so the use of the power itself isn't an issue. The main concerns are the degree to which it's used and the character that's built during this action. Rian Johnson explained the act as the equivalent of an adrenaline burst in normal humans, which explains the fact that we've not seen her using these powers before. But the bigger concern still remains. How is she still alive? To what extent did the Force allow her to survive the perilous void of space? Did it shield her from the debris and explosion when the blast reached the bridge? Did it pump oxygen into her lungs or brain, keeping her alive for the next few minutes? Because it's odd that she's unconscious for most of this. Is the Force acting independently, or is Leia's subconscious harnessing the power to keep herself alive? Because if she is able to keep a protective bubble around her for several minutes after being knocked out of her ship and into space while unconscious, I find it very hard to accept this as a fight-or-flight instinct. But what I care about more than any of that is that Leia's character isn't treated with respect here. The fact that she's blown up just to come back in the next few scenes without any change is as pointless as it gets. Leia hasn't grown as a character from this impactful experience. In fact, it's never mentioned again. Even after she wakes up, no one seems to care that Leia survived in space through the use of the Force. One would think that would be a big deal. More importantly, though, she faces no hardships. Leia doesn't struggle. The audience believed her to be dead, and when she opens her eyes, she has Force powers and successfully goes back to the ship. We don't understand the gravity, no pun intended, of the situation because it's made to look incredibly easy. And that opens up a whole nother can of worms. The sequel trilogy has canonized that the Force isn't hard to use anymore. If you think back to episode 5 when Luke could barely lift a lightsaber, much less an X-Wing, you felt for the guy. Everyone struggled to accomplish an extraneous task before. So when Leia is seen flying through space, like as many have said, Mary Poppins, the audience doesn't connect with that. They needed Holdo to take command, so they found the quickest way to temporarily dispose of Leia. The writing strings are not only showing themselves, but are tangling into a knot. It's lazy, it's convoluted, and the film simply hasn't earned the moment. Leia's beacon, that was introduced earlier as a plot device to connect Rey to the rest of the gang, drops as she's being wheeled off. Finn, hoping to save Rey from the destruction they're facing, picks it up and heads towards the escape pods. Transitioning back to Octo, we see Chewbacca. How about that? The next scene, reintroducing Luke and R2 and the Falcon, is one of the best in the movie, as we're finally getting some form of a proper reunion. However, it's not without its flaws as well. Chewie wasn't alerted when Luke powers on the Falcon, even though he was right outside. The film attempts to make us care about Han's dice, and Jake Skywalker manages to pop up a bit in the scene. He tells R2 he won't come back, and R2's reply is Leia's original message, begging Ben Kenobi for help. Luke appears to change his mind after the message, but when he wakes Rey, he tells her that he will train her to help her understand why the Jedi need to end, which is a bit odd considering the last scene. And now we return to the Raddus to introduce our newest character to the roster. An attendant is now addressing the crew, letting them know that Leia is recovering but unable to command. She continues by acknowledging the deaths of all their leadership, including Admiral Akbar. No stakes, no emotion, just poof, a fan favorite is dead now. Poe is upset as the attendant picks someone else to lead, as he was expecting to be selected himself. But since Poe is not ready for the responsibility of leadership, we are introduced to Vice Admiral Annalyn Holdo, a purple-haired woman in a long gray dress. Now, there is so much wrong with the creation and execution of this character, so much so that I found it hard to leave it all until now. Her character is so intricately woven into Poe's arc that it feels like she's infected him when she enters the film. For this scene, I'm going to have to take a step outside of the story and talk about the writing decisions, as the issues here don't revolve around the story per se, but instead the way Ryan decided to depict these characters in the context of the plot. So Holdo's introduction is designed to project a general message of hope for the downtrodden and oppressed. She remarks at how these underprivileged proletariats rely on the resistance, and that their goal now has to be survival for the restoration of the Republic. Note how she doesn't lay any groundwork for how they're going to do any of this. But with that, she sends the crew back to their posts. Poe appears to be uneasy about her leadership and confronts her, asking her what her plan of escape is. And here's where it gets dicey. Poe's reaction to Holdo throughout the speech resembles some form of discontent or wariness. Either he is suspicious about her capabilities, resentful that he wasn't picked himself, thus envious of her position, or he just doesn't like her. It's not really clear, but when she finishes talking, Poe turns to Kai and confirms that this is in fact the woman he'd heard war stories about in the past, and that she was not what he expected. And it's very strange why this was here at all. I'm honestly unsure of the narrative purpose of this line, but regardless of the intent, it doesn't play positively for Poe's character. He continues to move up to talk with Holdo, stating his rank as commander, then explaining the facts of their situation in a somewhat pompous manner, possibly to reinforce his desire to command, or maybe his disapproval of Holdo's appointment. She waves off Poe at first, showing her mutual distaste of him, then promptly dances around his question about her plan, redirecting the topic to his demotion to captain and how his dreadnought plan got their entire bombing fleet killed. And I'm going to try to clear this up. In The Force Awakens, Poe is noted to be the best pilot in the Resistance, with impulsive methods that led to an impressive track record. All of his exploits that we see on screen are thanks to his abilities as a pilot, but not a leader. What The Last Jedi is attempting is to give Poe a weakness that he has to overcome. Ryan must have noticed that in episode 7, all of Poe's victorious stunts are due to his skills, not the performance of the entire force. We haven't seen Poe make a decision that affects the lives of those other than himself before. That all makes sense. The problem lies in the message. Ryan wants Poe to be knocked down a few pegs when he hasn't done anything clearly wrong. As I explained earlier, nobody knew at that point in the battle what could happen. It was a gamble either way, and whether or not Poe's gut instinct influenced his decision to attack the Dreadnought is irrelevant. It was not a clear right or wrong decision, especially in hindsight. What with the First Order's ability to track ships through light speed, he most likely made the best call possible. And to have a main character beaten down the way Poe is, it really affects the view the audience will have on the one doing the beating. Following Holdo's condescending comments, Poe is modestly reduced to saying, "I just want to know what's going on." Holdo then belittles him once again, letting him know that she doesn't trust him and is not interested in letting him in on her plan. And here's the biggest problem with this dynamic. Rian Johnson writes his scenes according to his story's goal, not his character's motivation. At the beginning of the film, Poe makes a tough call and wins the day, but costing the lives of their bombing fleet. Leia chastises him, and Ryan inserts a remark by Poe about when you start an attack, you follow it through, a cockier side of Poe we've not seen before in conversation. Conflict occurs when the First Order catches up to them and Poe acts according to his character. But then when Ryan puts Leia into a coma, things begin to shift. Holdo walks in and Poe immediately has a different air to him. His expression during Holdo's speech is that of skepticism, and approaches her immediately mentioning his now incorrect rank in listing off the facts of their situation, possibly insinuating that he has a right to know what's going on. This is Ryan's attempt to push Poe into a less favorable position. Holdo starts right off the bat by condescending his every utterance and treating him like a child. The odd thing about this, though, is that Poe is beginning to act childish, but it is a byproduct of Ryan's writing, not the character himself. These two are throwing hissy fits at each other because Holdo is afraid Poe will endanger the Resistance, a character trait Ryan wrote in, and because Poe is now an entitled trigger-happy flyboy, a trait Ryan wrote in. The writing has been morphed to suit the desires of the writer, not the characters, and I had to make sure I separated this out because it isn't a question of consistency, as nothing in here explicitly breaks any character rules. Holdo is new, and Poe hasn't been shown to have many flaws before now. It's really just a question of why did Ryan feel the need to make this a central argument. It is upsetting for the audience to be put in a position where a new character with mysterious motives doesn't want our hero character in on her plan that she has the sole authority over. It makes her seem villainous, even though the film tells us something completely different later on. This is something I suppose I'll get into when we get to it, but the writing is obviously setting up something very specific. Ryan wants Poe to have flaws so that he can learn from them. The problem, as I said before, is that these character flaws don't line up with the actions he took during the Dreadnought scene. Had some members of his squadron look nervous about going forward with the plan, or even verbally question his orders, I would feel more comfortable with condemning his actions. But everyone in that battle showed themselves to be willing, even eager, to complete their mission. So when we see Poe in such a defeated way, it feels like a loss for the heroes. So moving on, we're heading right into Finn's story. So his character's been pretty backburner up until this point in the film, and we're really beginning to see his character motivation again here. We watch him revert back to his fearful pre-resistance character as he attempts to board an escape pod without being detected. He stops dead in his tracks when he sees Tweedledum, Rose Tico. He notices that she's in tears, looking down on a Haitian smelt medallion identical to the one Paige had. So we now understand that there is a significance to the necklaces, but it's unfortunate how surface deep the connection is. It would be interesting to learn more about the symbolism and lore associated with the design and origin of the medallion, but all we really get throughout the story is a loose familial connection and an underwhelming misdirection. So Finn begins to board the escape pod and Rose catches him, but gets caught off guard because he's a hero of the Resistance. I was actually quite charmed by the dialogue here, as it was both humorous and served to develop their relationship, although this is really the only development they get in the film. Unfortunately, this ends when Rose mentions how Finn really is a hero, quotes her dead sister, and explains how she electrocutes people who try to escape. She then realizes he is also trying to escape, so she zaps him and begins dragging him to the brig. Finn tries to convince her that he was simply protecting Rey by running. Rose calls him a selfish traitor, and Finn replies that the fleet can escape because they're being tracked through light speed. This means it's done by the lead ship, and Finn knows where the breaker room is on Snoke's ship because he mopped it. How convenient. So Rose and Finn are now on the same side. I find it interesting that both she and Finn know so much about trackers, considering their positions. It just seems all too opportune that they both happen to know exactly the information they need to know when they need to know it. But think about this. Rose is the plumber, at least some sort of engineer. Who will do her job if she leaves her Canto Bight? What if Holdo is informed that the pipe worker has gone missing? What if something breaks down and there's nobody to fix it? If something happened and she wasn't there, she could have been responsible for the deaths of everyone on that cruiser. Another example of why world building can sometimes be very useful. Anyway, they relay their previous conversation to Poe and explain that they're only being tracked from the lead ship, and if they disable the tracker, they can escape. They then contact Maz Kanata, the little orange creature from The Force Awakens, who explains that she can't help them, but can direct them to someone who can. Apparently, Maz had an affair with some rich casino guy, and she wants them to go find him so he can break into the supremacy. And my personal opinion, Master Codebreaker, is not the term I would have gone with to describe a person that infiltrates high-security warships. We now transition to Rey, who wakes up to find herself connected with Kylo Ren through the Force. I actually liked this concept and felt it had a lot of potential, but by the end of the film, their connection ends up being cut, and it doesn't leave much to think about. It becomes increasingly clear that Ryan only gave them the connection in the first place because he wanted them to be able to build a character relationship while separated. After their connection ends, we finally move on to some training. Rey says that Luke needs to come back because Kylo Ren is strong with the dark side, and Luke diverts, asking her what she knows about the Force. Luke tells her to sit down, and after a strange bit of comedy, he helps Rey to connect with the Force. She begins to feel it around her through the life on the island, and then finds it inside of herself. Luke explains that if the Jedi die, the light still remains, because the Jedi do not own the light side. While I understand the sentiment they're going for, it's not really a good defense for Luke abandoning the Republic, the Resistance, the Jedi Order, or his family, especially considering the Jedi were known to be the protectors of peace and justice throughout the galaxy. People are dying to protect the light, and Luke just doesn't seem to care. I guess true balance is just indifference. Rey begins to feel something else, something darker. It begins calling to her, and Luke is shocked when she doesn't resist it at all, possibly setting up a dark side element to her character. It is then revealed that Luke has cut himself off from the Force, and he storms off after explaining that he's only seen this kind of power before from Ben Solo, and it scares him. And it's really upsetting that this film has been written so that Ben Solo and Rey have surpassed Luke Skywalker with their abilities in the Force, even when Luke has at least 30 years on them. Finn and Rose briefly have a scene where they embark on their casino adventure and exclaim that the narrative countdown gives them about 18 hours to save the Resistance. Back to Rey again, we see her look excited about rain, which was really neat, being that she was born and raised on a desert planet. The Force then connects Kylo Ren to her once again, and they have a back and forth about how Luke may not have told Rey everything, and Kylo was a monster. We see that somehow Rey and Kylo's connection has transferred part of Rey's environment to Kylo. I was really stoked to see this develop, pieces of the material world transferring through the use of the Force. It was set up as an important element, but it also doesn't add up to much. So now we arrive for the critically loathed Canto Bight scene. We get the impression right off the bat that Rose is averse to going to the planet and wants to make it a quick in-and-out stop. So, strangely enough, they think parking on the beach is an intelligent decision. They don't even rethink it after the Redneck Alien tells them that they can't park there. Is there not a public casino parking area? We are then introduced to tons of zany characters, which is cool but terribly inconsequential in the long run. And it's worth mentioning that this set and cast of characters was a large chunk of the film's budget. They head out to the racing stadium where we see enslaved children, tortured animals, and greedy war profiteers. It's been mentioned by basically everyone at this point, but these messages make little sense in the context of this story as a whole. None of the elements in this scene play any part in the main story with the rest of the Resistance. Rose explains her personal history with her sister on a small mining system that was stripped of its raw materials and shelled for weapons testing by the First Order. She blames the casino patrons because she believes that they are all weapons contractors on the payroll of the First Order. It's strange to assume that everyone that spends their time gambling is a war profiteer. I have a feeling that there is more than one lucrative business in the galaxy that would allow someone to spend their time in a luxurious casino. On top of that, Rose's backstory plays no part in any events that unfold after they leave the planet. Same with the slave children, same with the Fathiers. The only element that extends slightly beyond the bounds of the planet revolves around the War Profiteers, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. BB-8 alerts our heroes that the Master Codebreaker has been located, but they are discovered by the Redneck Alien, and both get arrested for parking improperly. Meanwhile, BB-8 simply gets thrown out of the casino, rather than, being wiped or melted down for parts, because he'll be helpful later on. For now, though, we move on. So, Rey is training next to a rock with her staff. She decides to use Anakin's lightsaber, gets caught off guard when she sees Luke watching her, then uncontrollably slashes through the rock, hinting again at her lack of resistance to the dark side. More jokes, then we move into Luke's second lesson. He explains how the Jedi have been romanticized over the years, similarly to how fans have romanticized them in real life. But Luke's point is that they are not worthy of the praise, as they were hypocrites and failures. This concept of the balance had a lot of potential, and this dialogue had got my hopes up for that kind of story, but it also doesn't lead to anything. So Luke talks about how he started a temple that held Ben and a handful of students, and a flashback takes us to years prior, showing how Ben betrayed Luke, collapsed a building on him, then burned the temple. Some of Luke's students went with him, while the rest were murdered. Luke, blaming himself, went into exile, and consequently that is the entire reason why the sequel trilogy exists. The Resistance's medical frigate now runs out of fuel and gets obliterated by the First Order. Holdo doesn't do anything about it. Finn and Rose are in jail now and are discussing how they can find a new codebreaker. And right on cue, Benicio del Toro speaks up from across the room and is willing and able to break into whatever they need broken into. How convenient. Seriously, everything is riding on coincidences. This convoluted mess is a complete waste of screen time. The codebreaker guy breaks out with a key card and Finn and Rose run off. We see DJ, oh yeah, his name's DJ, run into BB-8, restraining 3 guards by itself. Another guard comes up and BB-8 shoots him with a coin slot machine gun, and in the goofiest way possible. We get a shot of DJ throwing fake punches in reaction to BB-8's attack as the guard slowly gets pushed back by the non-lethal metal projectiles. DJ hits the guard with his boot, knocking him out, and BB-8 blows steam off of its strange coin slot contraption. I'm sorry, but this is Star Wars, not a Buster Keaton film. Rose and Finn come out the other end of a sewer and enter the Fathier stables, where they find a little slave boy who keeps quiet because they let him know they're part of the Resistance. So begins our Fathier scene, where our heroes escape through the casino grounds, closely followed by smaller security ships. They crash through the lobby of the casino, and the Fathiers trample everything in sight. They make it outside and to the ship where the security blows up Finn and Rose's escape pod. The Fathiers move on, and Finn and Rose manage to lose the ships by breaking off from the herd. Once they've lost the casino security, Finn expresses his opinion that tearing up the town was worth it because they made the War Profiteers hurt. And this is where the message betrays the characters. Finn should not want anyone in the casino to be hurt. He doesn't know a thing about a single person in there, yet he's grouping them with his opposed villains by virtue of being in the same building. What if some newlywed couple spent their honeymoon at this casino and got trampled to death? And why would he even want the Profiteers to get hurt? They make a living manufacturing weapons used by both sides of the war. They're not enslaving children or animals either. That's the casino. But it doesn't make much sense that they're doing that anyway, since droids are manufactured to do human tasks at a fraction of the cost. It's not like they're in the Outer Rim full of criminals and tribal governments. The animals make sense for sport, but hiring children just seems impractical and inefficient. The messages have allowed the story to deviate so far from its original path that we're now discussing topics that have no bearing on the story at hand. But finally, Rose releases the Fathier's saddle and says, now it's worth it. No, it's really not. Your buddies are still fleeing for their lives, and these horse dogs are going to be captured within 24 hours, guaranteed. The casino is probably insured, so it will be repaired with little hassle. The customers will be compensated, the slaves will be punished, and will probably end up having to clean everything. And the War Profiteers will still be profiting off of war. The animals are still racing, the First Order is still winning, and your friends are still dying. You solved nothing. DJ pops up with BB-8 in a spaceship that they stole, so they leave and head for the First Order supremacy. The end of Canto Bight. We're now back on Octo, where we see Luke reconnecting with the Force and with Leia, which honestly was really cool to watch. Despite how quick it was, it felt like just for a moment, that was Luke Skywalker. Rey then has another Force connection with Ben Swolo, and they make a funny about his shirtless bod. She asks why he killed his father, and he deflects to a conversation about her parents. Keep this in mind, we're establishing that this is important once again. Anyway, Kylo asks Rey if Luke told her about the night he betrayed him. She says yes, but Kylo knows the whole truth wasn't told, so he explains an alternate view of the night, where Luke tried to murder him in cold blood because he was afraid of his power. She doesn't believe him, and Kylo then introduces his mantra of the film: let the past die. Kill it if you have to. That's the only way to become what you're meant to be. This is a terrible message for a film, especially a sequel, and especially a Star Wars sequel. The concept of unity is incredibly important in franchises and interconnected storytelling, and it shows here. What Lucasfilm and effectively Disney is doing here is pushing the main characters of the past 2 trilogies away in order to bring the new characters to the forefront. This is a massive mistake for a number of reasons. I won't hang on to this for any longer, but I felt it was necessary to point out because it's such a detrimental flaw of the sequel trilogy, and it's really depressing. So now we're bringing back Rey's dark side plot thread as she finds the mysterious hole in the ground from her vision. She crouches down to get a better look and is pulled in, where she falls into a pool of water. And I'm about the last person to mention this, but she shouldn't be able to swim having grown up on a desert planet, especially when it shows her just minutes ago admiring rain. Rey walks up to a mirror, and the filmmakers have an acid trip where Rey asks who her parents are, and the mirror tells her basically nothing. In this next scene, Rey is back in a hut with Kylo Ren, and they're bonding? All Rey has been doing since their connection was chastise him for murdering his father. Why are they suddenly friends or lovers or whatever this movie's trying to tell me they are? 5 minutes ago you were trying to understand why he killed his father, and now you just accept his morality of killing the past. Rey says it isn't too late, referring to Kylo turning back to the light side. They both reach out their hands and touch fingertips. Again, a reference to the water transfer from earlier, but it doesn't lead anywhere. Luke barges in, blows up the roof, and insists that Rey leave the island. She hits him with her staff, and they fight. This is Luke's first and last fight of the sequel trilogy. Rey wins this fight. She asks him for the truth, and Luke reveals that he didn't try to murder Kylo in cold blood. He just almost did. Luke had a gut instinct to kill his nephew in order to stop massive amounts of pain and suffering because Snoke had turned his heart. This is another glaring example of changing Luke's character in between films with no explanation. There are a few reasons why this is an objectively bad writing decision, and I'm going to go through them. First and foremost, it is a disservice to the fans that view Luke as a childhood hero. When writing characters that have a history and a fan base, it is essential to write in line with the history and for the fan base. When I walked into the theater, I had no idea what to expect. I hoped to see wisdom, composition, and a badass. A Luke Skywalker who has grown from the farm boy on Tatooine to a Jedi Master with knowledge worthy of being passed down. But that's not to say I went into the theater with a set of predetermined expectations. I went in with a clear head. I came out unsettled. Let me try to explain. Audiences don't always know exactly what they want. They can say they want one thing, but be completely blown away by a decision that goes in the complete opposite direction. This is why I don't buy the whole fan expectation shtick that apologists of the film play at. I agree that viewers can have a baseline scale for what they're paying to see, but it doesn't mean anything is set in stone. And having your expectations subverted can be incredibly exhilarating when executed properly. Given the trajectory of the Luke we knew from Return of the Jedi, a teacher was where he was headed, and it was a logical direction to lead him in. However, I don't have a problem with him being a reclusive hermit either, given a few criteria that is. The first being, show us what happened. The best way to express Luke's ideological shift would be through flashbacks of himself and Ben, portraying his slow turn into a pessimistic old man that failed his student due to his shortcomings. A second criterion would be that, if this was the direction they went with, have Luke's character redeem himself. There are ways to craft Luke as a recluse without shattering everything we respected and loved about his character. Second point, this writing choice devalues all of his accomplishments from the original trilogy. Luke was a cultural icon, not because he swung a lightsaber around and did cool flips, but because his character was grounded in the light. He was good to the core, willing to do whatever it took to save the ones he loved. This new character seems to have a completely different set of impulses than that of the Luke we knew before. One of Luke's flaws of the original trilogy, as a matter of fact, was being reckless and impatient. And while they were often to his detriment, he always did them out of kind-heartedness and stubborn determination. Luke's reactionary instinct in this scene shows a blatant lack of understanding of his character. Is it possible that Luke saw Ben's future and considered the option of sacrificing him in order to prevent galactic chaos? Yeah. But the fact that he didn't self-correct before going all the way to ignite his lightsaber and raise it to strike shows that something drastic must have happened to change this character, and the audience needs answers. As I explained, this set of impulses does not line up with his character. Third, his connection to Ben Solo would have prevented this so-called instinctive move. According to the Luke we know, he values his family and friends more than anything else. If Ben Solo is the son of Han Solo and Leia Organa, his best friend and his sister, he has known this child since birth. He has most likely been around when Ben grew up as a child, seen him grow strong in the Force. He took him on as an apprentice, teaching him how to hone his Force abilities, as well as how to wield a lightsaber. This is over the course of probably 20 or so years. How could anyone believe that for a second, with their history and connection, Luke was willing to kill this boy? This scene has such a poor understanding of character development, world building, and story progression that it broke my heart. I didn't want to see this happen to Luke Skywalker. I didn't ask for this to happen to my hero. And I guess I'll stop there for now. Thank you so very much for watching the first part of my series. I spend several months on each of these videos and take great care when producing them. I've gone to lengthy efforts to explain my positions from a technical writing standpoint, and I avoided using emotional arguments as much as possible. But it's important that I'm clear. Filmmaking, film analysis, and narrative writing in general, it's not an exact science. That's not to clear myself from blame for any mistakes I might have made, but to explain that this is a procedural conversation, and in order for us to be better viewers, critics, and creators, we have to acknowledge the possibility of error. So, consider it acknowledged. I'm happy to discuss points and counterpoints to any of my proposed arguments, and I'm more than happy to concede if there's enough evidence against my case. But to the best of my knowledge, I have provided a cogent analysis on the many foundational, deep-seated problems that lay throughout The Last Jedi, in effect leading it to become the most polarized Star Wars film to date. And we're only halfway through the movie. Next time, I'll be finishing up my analysis going through the second half of The Last Jedi and re-establishing my main points against the film. From there, we'll move into part 3, where I'll introduce my suggested rewrites of Episode 7, leading us into my rewrite of Episode 8. So until then, thanks again, and I'll see you for part 2.